In recent months, trade and geopolitical tensions between the United States and China have reached a new level. At the same time, it is precisely America's allies who are becoming key elements in this confrontation, and their positioning may prove decisive. The United States urgently needs allies because competing with China alone is a heavy burden. But the problem is that the current American President Donald Trump's policies over the past 2 to 3 years have seriously undermined trust and allied commitments. He imposed massive tariffs without making significant concessions to partners, which led to a cooling of relations even with Washington's closest allies. One of those allies that may now be at a turning point is Japan. Japan has long been considered one of the pillars of America's strategy in Asia, the largest economic partner of the United States, a highly developed technological power, an important military and political ally. However, the situation has begun to shift. A new factor has emerged with the rise to power of new leadership in Japan, and at the center of attention is the political style and foreign policy orientation of the new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. According to reliable Western publications and insiders in Tokyo, her appointment and policy could create serious problems for U.S. strategy. First, briefly about the essence of the confrontation. The United States and China are locked in a trade war involving a wide spectrum of tariffs, restrictions, investments, and technological competition. The Trump administration announced new tariffs on Chinese exports not only in traditionally sensitive areas, such as high technology or components, but also on industrial goods, metals, aluminum, steel, and consumer products. This policy was introduced with the declared goal of punishing China for unfair trade and protecting American jobs. In Beijing, however, it was perceived as an act of economic pressure aimed at undermining China's growth and stability. In response, China imposed mirror measures, hitting key American export sectors, including agriculture, aviation components, and energy. Beneath the trade barriers lies an emerging geopolitical confrontation. At the same time, at sea and in regional flashpoints, China's Navy is conducting increasingly bold maneuvers. Analysts report that Chinese naval vessels are approaching U.S. carrier strike groups at minimal safe distances, crossing their course and forcing American crews to take evasive action. These moves have already been labeled by analysts as shadow tactics, when an adversary's ship stays so close that its presence is physically felt, yet technically does not violate international law. The goal is to test the U.S. reaction and show that pressure can be exerted not only economically, but also through military presence. Now, to Japan and its role. Against this tense backdrop, Japan faces a choice: either deepen cooperation with the United States or seek a more independent or even China-leaning course. And it is precisely at this moment that Sanae Takaichi comes to power, the first female prime minister of Japan, elected leader of the ruling party and preparing to head the government. The paradox, however, is that according to observers, Takaichi is not seeking to automatically follow the U.S. line. On the contrary, her policy could open the door to rethinking Tokyo's relationship with Washington and Beijing. Some sources note that while her views on China are fairly tough, Japan may use the situation for its own strategic maneuvering, positioning itself not merely as a U.S. satellite, but as an equal partner or even a player capable of shifting between sides depending on its interests. For the United States, losing Japan as a reliable ally would be a heavy blow. Imagine, American strategy in the Indo-Pacific region has been built around a framework of the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India, the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. But if Japan suddenly signals that closer alignment with China, or even neutrality is more beneficial to its interests, it will mark a clear sign that the United States is losing one of its most important strategic footholds. And considering that India, as many analysts note, has already begun moving toward greater autonomy, Washington could find itself without strategic depth. It is important to emphasize that this is not just an economic issue, although the economy plays a central role here. This is a strategic issue. The United States is competing with China on nearly every front: economic, technological, political, and military. Fighting on two fronts, meaning against China, while simultaneously managing alliances, is extremely costly and painful. When one ally begins to drift away, the burden on Washington increases exponentially. This is why so much attention is focused on U.S.-Japan negotiations. To keep Japan on its side, Washington will have to make serious concessions. Insider circles are already suggesting that Trump, aware of the risks, will be forced to soften his tariff stance, either by offering Tokyo special trade preferences or by revising the terms of defense and technological cooperation. In other words, the policy of any concession being perceived as weakness may turn out to be too expensive. The United States is forced to show flexibility. The next scenario may look like this. Takaichi comes to power, is described domestically as pursuing a hard conservative line, but on the foreign policy stage, begins to take steps that resemble a reset of Japan's diplomacy. In this situation, she may start publicly criticizing U.S. tariffs and trade policy as unfair, giving China and other partners a reason to view Japan differently. Analysts and insiders warn that if Tokyo applies retaliatory tariffs on U.S. industries or exports, it will be a direct blow to American interests. This could take the form of Japan imposing duties on certain U.S. goods, signaling it may reduce or dump U.S. Treasury bond holdings, or making a public relations move, declaring its intention to balance between Washington and Beijing. All of this would increase pressure on the United States. Economically, Japan represents a massive market. Losing Japan as a reliable buyer and investor would be a major blow, especially given that U.S. industrial exports are already under strain. And if Japan begins openly cooperating with China, or fully integrates into the Chinese supply chain, the United States could face the loss of its competitive advantage. In terms of trade and technology, this would be not only an economic setback, but a strategic defeat. It is also worth noting that the new Japanese Prime Minister has publicly stated she intends to prioritize Japanese interests over being a submissive ally of the United States. According to the diplomat, Takaichi's potential course could raise concerns across the region. The United States, for its part, understands that keeping Japan requires more than just promises of security. It may involve reviewing tariffs, offering a more flexible trade agreement, increasing U.S. defense commitments to Japan, or easing pressure on Japanese companies hurt by American sanctions or tariffs. None of this will be easy. The situation is further complicated by the fact that China is not standing still. When U.S. allies begin showing signs of drifting or neutrality, Beijing moves in with stronger offers, investment incentives, preferential access to markets, joint projects, to encourage alignment with China. If Japan feels the U.S. offer is insufficient or that the cost of alliance is too high, China will be ready to fill the vacuum. This creates a dangerous cycle. The U.S. loses an ally, China steps in, the U.S. is forced to stretch its efforts and resources even further. Ultimately, for Trump, the situation is clear. Keeping Japan is critical. If Japan drifts away or adopts a neutral position, his trade and geopolitical strategy is at risk of collapsing. The loss of Japan would become a symbolic sign of the collapse of Trump's policy, which from the very beginning was built on aggressive tariffs and a hard line. If an ally signals fatigue with such a regime and starts seeking alternatives, it is a clear indicator that the strategy is failing. In conclusion, against the backdrop of the trade confrontation between the United States and China, and at a time when the United States is already beginning to lose allies or see them question their role, Japan under the new leadership of Takaichi could become one of the most sensitive points. If the United States fails to keep Japan, it will not just be bad news but a powerful signal that Trump's strategy has broken down, and that in the coming years, America could find itself in a far weaker position. That is why today, the task for Washington is to take talks with Tokyo with the utmost seriousness, make steps toward compromise, offer support, and reduce the risk of a Japanese pivot.